He used a neti pot. 72 hours later, he was in a coma. Doctors thought they knew exactly what had happened. The answer seemed obvious. The timeline fit. The symptoms fit. The neti pot fit. But every test kept pointing in the wrong direction, because the thing everyone blamed wasn't actually responsible. And by the time doctors discovered the truth, his brain had already suffered permanent damage. When he finally opened his eyes, the nightmare was only just beginning.
This is Hidden Pathogens?
38-year-old Donald Walsh had been dealing with blocked sinuses for nearly a week. He woke up every morning feeling stuffed up. Breathing through his nose felt like trying to suck air through a straw. It wasn't stopping him from working. It wasn't keeping him in bed. It was simply irritating. The kind of problem most people ignore. The kind of problem that doesn't seem capable of changing a life. At first, Donald blamed the weather. Then seasonal allergies. Then a lingering cold he couldn't quite shake. Whatever the cause, he wanted relief. Fast. A coworker suggested something simple. A neti pot. Donald had heard of them before. The small teapot-shaped devices had become incredibly popular for sinus irrigation. Millions of people use them every year to flush mucus and irritants from their nasal passages. The concept seemed straightforward. Mix water with a saline solution. Pour it into one nostril. Let it flow through the sinuses and out the other side. Unpleasant, but effective. That evening, Donald stopped by a pharmacy on his way home and bought one. His wife laughed when she saw it sitting on the bathroom counter. "You actually bought one of those?" Donald shrugged. "If it helps me breathe, I don't care how ridiculous it looks." The next morning, he tried it for the first time. The sensation was strange. Warm water moving through places he never thought about. For a few seconds, it felt uncomfortable. Then something happened. His nose cleared. Completely. For the first time in days, he could breathe normally. The pressure behind his eyes seemed lighter. His head felt clearer. He was impressed. By breakfast, he was already recommending it to his wife. "You should try this thing." She rolled her eyes. "I think I'll survive without pouring water through my skull." Donald laughed, but he was sold. That night, he used it again. The next morning, he used it again. Each time, the congestion improved. Each time, he felt a little better. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed dangerous. If anything, the neti pot appeared to be solving the problem. Which is why what happened 72 hours later made absolutely no sense. Because the first symptom wasn't congestion. It wasn't sinus pain. It wasn't even a runny nose. It was a headache so severe that Donald stopped what he was doing and sat down. And from that moment forward, everything began to unravel. The headache didn't feel like a normal headache. It wasn't dull. It wasn't the kind that fades after water or rest. It was sharp, in a way Donald Walsh couldn't ignore. Deep behind the eyes, pressing outward from inside his skull. He assumed it was unrelated. Maybe dehydration. Maybe stress. He took painkillers and tried to continue his day. It didn't help much. By the afternoon, something else appeared. Fatigue. Not ordinary tiredness from a long day. This was heavier. The kind of exhaustion that made simple movements feel delayed. Like his body was reacting a second too late. At his desk, he found himself staring at the screen without reading anything. Words blurred together. He blinked repeatedly, trying to reset his focus. It didn't work. Coworkers noticed first. "You all right?" one of them asked. "Yeah," Donald replied quickly. "Just didn't sleep well." But even as he said it, he didn't fully believe it. That evening, he skipped dinner. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because the idea of eating felt like effort. His wife noticed immediately when he got home. "You look pale," she said. "I'm fine," he insisted. But he wasn't fine. Something was off. Not dramatically, not enough to panic, just enough to feel wrong. He went to bed early, hoping sleep would fix whatever was happening, but lying down made it worse. The headache intensified in the quiet. The fatigue didn't lift. And then, something new began to surface. Moments where his thoughts didn't feel fully connected. He would reach for a word and lose it halfway. He would start a sentence and forget where it was going. At one point, he sat up in bed and asked his wife a question, then immediately forgot what he had asked. She laughed nervously. "You're really out of it tonight." Donald didn't respond, because he was starting to realize something unsettling. This didn't feel like a normal illness. It felt like something was moving in the wrong direction, and it was moving fast. He was trying to stay upright. The headache had escalated overnight, becoming constant instead of waves of pain. His fatigue had deepened into something heavier, like his body was pulling him downward with every step. Even walking from the bedroom to the bathroom felt uneven. His wife didn't wait for an argument. She grabbed his keys. "We're going to the hospital." Donald tried to protest, but the words didn't come out cleanly. He nodded instead. The emergency room was bright, loud, and disorienting. He sat in the intake chair, blinking too slowly, struggling to focus on the questions being asked. When did it start? Headache. When did it get worse? He paused. He couldn't remember exactly. That realization unsettled him more than the pain. Soon he was moved into a bed. Blood pressure, temperature, blood tests. Questions repeated by different nurses. His answers started to feel automatic, detached from meaning. A young doctor finally entered the room, scanning the chart. Any recent infections? Cold, flu, sinus issues? Donald's wife answered before he could. Sinus congestion. He started using a Neti pot a few days ago. That detail changed the room's tone immediately. The doctor looked up. A Neti pot? She nodded. The doctor leaned slightly forward. Tap water or distilled? Donald's wife hesitated. I'm not sure. The doctor didn't say anything for a moment. Just wrote something down. Then spoke carefully. We need to consider a possible sinus-related infection, something that may have traveled beyond the nasal passages. The word infection hung in the air longer than anything else. Donald tried to sit up. His head spun slightly. He lay back down. A CT scan was ordered. Neurology was contacted. And for the first time since it began, the situation stopped feeling like a routine illness. It started feeling like an investigation. For Donald Walsh's wife, it felt like they were finally getting answers. But over the next few hours, the situation changed. Fast. A nurse entered the room to check his vitals and noticed something strange. Donald wasn't responding normally. His eyes were open, but he seemed distant, almost disconnected. Donald. No response. She repeated his name. This time, he turned toward her, slowly, confused, as if he wasn't entirely sure where he was. The nurse immediately notified the physician. By the time the doctor returned, Donald's condition had worsened again. Simple questions suddenly became difficult. What year is it? Long pause. What hospital are you in? Another pause. Then, an answer that made no sense. His wife felt her stomach drop. Just hours earlier, he had driven himself to the emergency room. Now he seemed unable to process basic information. The doctor ordered additional neurological testing. Something was happening inside his brain. The question was what? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. A few minutes later, Donald suddenly stopped speaking. His body became rigid. The conversation in the room ended instantly. Then his arms jerked violently. A nurse shouted for help. Monitors began alarming. More staff rushed through the doorway. His wife backed against the wall, frozen. She had never seen a seizure before. The movements looked unnatural, terrifying, as if his body had stopped obeying him. The seizure lasted less than 2 minutes. To his wife, it felt like an hour. When it ended, Donald didn't recover the way everyone hoped. Instead, he appeared even less responsive. His eyes opened briefly, then closed again. Doctors moved quickly. Medication was administered. More scans were ordered. Neurology arrived. The room that had seemed calm only an hour earlier now felt like a crisis zone. One physician pulled his wife aside. We're very concerned about swelling or inflammation affecting his brain. The words barely registered. Brain, swelling, inflammation. None of them sounded compatible with the healthy man she had shared breakfast with, just days earlier. Back in the room, Donald's condition continued to deteriorate. He stopped answering questions completely. Then he stopped following commands. Then he stopped responding altogether. Doctors prepared for the possibility that he could no longer protect his own airway. The decision was made quickly. He would need to be intubated. A breathing tube was placed. Machines took over the work his body could no longer do safely. His wife stood outside the room as staff moved around him. The transformation was almost impossible to comprehend. 3 days earlier, he had been complaining about sinus congestion. Now an entire medical team was fighting to keep him alive. Hours later, a neurologist reviewed the latest findings. The situation was critical. Donald's brain was under attack, but nobody knew why. Not yet. As midnight approached, doctors made a decision they had hoped to avoid. To protect his brain and stabilize his condition, they would place him into a medically induced coma. His wife listened in silence. The words sounded unreal. Coma. It was the kind of thing that happened in movies. Not to people who bought a Neti pot at a pharmacy. Not to people who went to work on Monday. Not to people who were healthy a week ago. Yet here they were. As medications flowed through his IV line, Donald slipped into unconsciousness. The monitors continued their steady rhythm. The ventilator hissed beside his bed. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he was completely silent. Doctors believed an infection was responsible. The evidence seemed to point in one direction: a recent sinus problem, a recently used neti pot, a rapidly deteriorating brain. The connection appeared obvious, but over the next several days, that obvious answer would begin to fall apart. As Donald lay unconscious in the intensive care unit, his family searched desperately for answers. Everyone kept asking the same question: what changed? What happened in the days before he got sick? His wife replayed the week over and over in her mind. The congestion, the headaches, the fatigue, the emergency room, the seizure. Then she remembered something that seemed insignificant at the time: the neti pot. Suddenly, it didn't seem insignificant anymore. She mentioned it to a nurse. The nurse mentioned it to a physician. Soon, everyone involved in Donald's care knew about it. The timing was difficult to ignore. A healthy man develops sinus problems. He starts flushing water through his nasal passages. 72 hours later, he's in a coma. Even to the family, the connection felt obvious. Then someone asked a question. What kind of water was he using? His wife froze. She wasn't sure. She had seen him mixing the saline packets. She had seen him standing over the bathroom sink, but she couldn't remember what water he had used. Tap water? Filtered water? Bottled water? She honestly didn't know. The uncertainty immediately raised concern, because there was a frightening possibility that every doctor in the room was familiar with. A rare organism, one that could enter through the nose, one that could travel directly toward the brain, one that had made headlines before. The brain-eating amoeba. The phrase alone was enough to terrify families. News reports had covered cases for years. Healthy people exposed to contaminated water, headaches, confusion, seizures, rapid neurological decline, often fatal. The symptoms seemed to fit, at least on the surface. Doctors never told the family they had found an amoeba. They hadn't, but they couldn't ignore the possibility. Not yet. The ICU team ordered additional testing. Infectious disease specialists were consulted. Samples would need to be analyzed. Questions would need to be answered. Meanwhile, word spread through the family. By the second day in intensive care, relatives weren't talking about seizures anymore. They weren't talking about brain swelling. They weren't talking about encephalitis. They were talking about the neti pot and the terrifying stories they had seen online. Some became convinced they already knew what had happened. The timeline seemed too perfect. The symptoms seemed too familiar. The explanation seemed too obvious. Even Donald's wife started to believe it. In her mind, The story had already been written. He used the Neti pot. The water carried something dangerous. That organism reached his brain. Now he was fighting for his life. Simple, tragic, understandable. There was just one problem. The evidence wasn't cooperating. Doctors began receiving the first test results, then the second, then the third, and instead of confirming their theory, the results started creating new questions. Questions nobody expected, because the deeper they looked, the harder it became to prove that the Neti pot had anything to do with Donald's condition at all. The explanation everyone believed was beginning to crack, and hidden beneath it was a much stranger truth. At first, everyone expected the test results to confirm what they already believed: the Neti pot, the contaminated water, the brain infection. The story seemed too perfect to be wrong. But then, the first results arrived, and they didn't show what doctors expected. No amoeba. The infectious disease team wasn't alarmed yet. One test wasn't enough. More samples were analyzed. More cultures were run. More specialists reviewed the findings. Then, the next results came back. Again, nothing. No amoeba. No parasites. No dangerous organisms. No evidence that anything had entered through his nasal passages. The room grew quieter. Doctors began looking at each other differently. The confidence they had felt only days earlier was fading. Then investigators turned their attention to the Neti pot itself. If the device was responsible, traces should still be there. Something should show up. A contaminant, a microorganism, anything. Instead, the examination produced another surprise. The Neti pot was clean, completely clean. No dangerous organisms, no hidden contamination, nothing unusual at all. The family was stunned. If the device wasn't contaminated, then what had happened? The next step seemed obvious. Test the water. Doctors obtained samples from the home, the faucet, the plumbing, everything that could have been connected to the case. For days, the family waited. And when the results finally arrived, they delivered another shock. The water was clean, no amoeba, no dangerous bacteria, no rare organisms, no explanation, nothing. The evidence that everyone expected simply didn't exist. Doctors reviewed the timeline again. Then again, then again. The symptoms were real. The seizure was real. The coma was real. The brain inflammation was real. But the thing everyone blamed wasn't cooperating. Every path led to a dead end. The Neti pot looked guilty. The timeline looked guilty. The circumstances looked guilty. Yet every test kept saying the same thing. No. No contamination. No infection source. No proof. For Donald's wife, the realization was almost harder than the original theory. At least the Neti pot explanation made sense. At least it provided a reason. Now even that was gone. The family wasn't moving closer to an answer. They were moving further away from one. Meanwhile, Donald's condition remained critical. The swelling in his brain continued. His doctors still didn't know why, and that uncertainty was becoming dangerous. Because every hour spent chasing the wrong explanation was an hour the real cause remained untreated. The question had changed. No longer what was in the water. Now it was, if the Neti pot didn't do this, what did? The answer would force doctors to abandon everything they thought they knew about the case, and it had been hiding in plain sight from the very beginning. By the fifth day, Donald Walsh's doctors were running out of obvious explanations. The infection theory was collapsing. Every test pointed away from the Neti pot, away from contaminated water, away from amoebas, away from parasites. Yet Donald remained in a coma. Something was attacking his brain. The question was what? A neurologist decided to review the case from the beginning. Not the assumptions, the facts. Donald had developed headaches, then fatigue, then confusion, then seizures, then severe brain inflammation. The pattern reminded her of something she had seen before. Rarely, but enough to recognize it. She ordered another series of tests. This time, they weren't looking for an infection. They were looking for evidence that Donald's own immune system had turned against him. The results took time, long, agonizing days. Days during which Donald remained motionless in his ICU bed. Days during which his wife barely left the hospital. Days during which nobody knew whether he would survive. Then the phone call came. The neurologist entered the room, carrying a folder. For the first time in nearly a week, she looked confident. "We think we know what's causing this." Donald's wife immediately braced herself. Another infection? Another organism? Another contaminant? The doctor shook her head. "No." She opened the folder. "It's autoimmune encephalitis." The room went silent. Nobody had heard the term before. The doctor explained. For reasons that aren't always understood, the body's immune system can sometimes become confused. Instead of attacking viruses or bacteria, it attacks healthy brain tissue. The brain begins to swell. Neurons stop communicating properly. The patient develops headaches, fatigue, memory problems, confusion, seizures, and in severe cases, coma. Every symptom fit perfectly. The horrifying truth began to emerge. Nothing had entered Donald's brain. No parasite, no amoeba, no contaminated water. The attack had come from inside his own body. His immune system had mistaken his brain for an enemy, and it had been winning. The neti pot had simply appeared at the wrong moment. A coincidence, a distraction, a perfectly believable explanation that happened to be completely wrong. For days, doctors had been investigating something that wasn't there. Meanwhile, the real disease had been hiding in plain sight. The discovery changed everything. Because unlike many infections, autoimmune encephalitis sometimes responds to treatment, if doctors act quickly. High-dose steroids were started. Additional immune-suppressing therapies followed. Specialists worked around the clock. For the first time since Donald entered the hospital, the medical team wasn't guessing anymore. They were fighting the actual disease. But a new fear now emerged. The inflammation had been raging inside Donald's brain for days. The doctors could stop the attack, maybe. What they couldn't yet determine was how much damage had already been done. And that answer wouldn't come until he woke up. If he woke up. Weeks later, the machines around his bed would finally begin to change. The swelling would start to decrease. His vital signs would stabilize. And doctors would make a decision that his family had been praying for. It was time to bring him out of the coma. What happened next would shock everyone in the room. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. And if you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. Let's continue. The day Donald Walsh opened his eyes should have been the happiest day of the entire ordeal. For nearly 3 weeks, his family had lived in a state of constant uncertainty. Every phone call from the hospital triggered fear. Every conversation with a doctor carried the possibility of bad news. Every morning began with the same question: would he survive? Now, at last, there was hope. The swelling in his brain had begun to decrease. The treatments appeared to be working. The medical team gradually reduced the medications, keeping him unconscious. Then one morning, a nurse noticed movement. A finger, a slight twitch. Nothing dramatic, but enough to bring people running. His wife was called immediately. Within minutes, she was standing beside his bed, watching, waiting, praying. Then it happened. Donald opened his eyes. The room erupted with emotion. His wife burst into tears. A nurse smiled. One of the physicians actually laughed. After everything that had happened, it felt like a miracle. Donald blinked several times, slowly, as though he were trying to understand where he was. His wife squeezed his hand. Donald. His eyes moved toward her voice. She felt relief flood through her body. He was back. He had survived. The nightmare was finally over. At least that's what everyone thought. A few minutes later, Donald looked directly at her. and asked a question. "Who are you?" The room became silent. His wife froze. At first, she thought she had misunderstood. Maybe the breathing tube was affecting his speech. Maybe he was still confused from the medication. The doctor stepped forward. "Donald, do you know where you are?" He slowly looked around the room. "No." His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. The doctor asked another question. "What year is it?" Donald answered. The answer was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Years wrong. The celebration disappeared instantly. Doctors exchanged concerned glances. The family stared in disbelief. This wasn't normal grogginess. This wasn't someone waking up after a long sleep. Something wasn't right. Over the next several hours, the problem became impossible to ignore. Donald remembered his childhood. He remembered his first car. He remembered his high school graduation. But huge portions of his adult life seemed to be missing. Entire years had vanished. Names disappeared. Memories disappeared. People disappeared. At one point, his wife showed him a photo from their wedding. Donald studied it carefully, then looked back at her, confused. "I know that's me, but I don't remember this." His wife began crying again, this time for a very different reason. The doctors had stopped the autoimmune attack. They had saved his life, but they couldn't undo everything it had already done. For weeks, inflammation had disrupted some of the most important networks in his brain: memory, recognition, language, personality. No one yet knew what would return, or what had been lost forever. The family had spent weeks hoping Donald would wake up. Now he finally had. And they were facing a terrifying new question. How much of Donald had actually come back? Because surviving the disease was only the first battle. The second battle was figuring out whether he could rebuild the life it had shattered. The first few days after Donald Walsh woke up were filled with cautious optimism. He was alive. He was talking. He could follow simple instructions. Compared to where he had been just weeks earlier, it felt like a miracle. But the longer his family spent with him, the more they realized something was terribly wrong. Donald remembered being 10 years old. He remembered the bike he rode through his neighborhood. He remembered the name of his third-grade teacher. He remembered childhood vacations, old friends, embarrassing moments from high school. The memories were vivid, detailed, almost untouched. But when conversations moved closer to the present, everything fell apart. One afternoon, a nurse asked about his job. Donald stared blankly. What job? The nurse thought he was joking. He wasn't. He couldn't remember where he worked. A few hours later, his brother visited. Donald recognized him immediately. But when his brother asked about a fishing trip they had taken just 2 years earlier, Donald looked confused. "I've never been fishing with you." His brother laughed, then realized Donald was serious. The laughter stopped. The disease hadn't erased Donald's entire memory. It had erased pieces of it, random pieces, important pieces. Entire sections of his adult life had become unreachable. And there was another problem, a stranger problem, one that was even harder for the family to understand. His personality had changed. Before the illness, Donald had been patient, easygoing, the kind of person who rarely raised his voice. Now small frustrations triggered sudden anger. A television channel changed unexpectedly. He became irritated. A nurse asked the same question twice. He snapped. His wife arrived 10 minutes later than expected. He accused her of abandoning him. The outbursts were brief, but shocking. This wasn't the Donald they knew. Doctors weren't surprised. Inflammation had affected areas of the brain responsible for emotion, memory, and behavior. The disease was gone, but its fingerprints remained. One evening, his wife brought a photo album to the hospital. She hoped familiar images might help stimulate memories. Page after page showed moments from their life together. Vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, family gatherings. Donald studied every photograph carefully. Sometimes he remembered. Most of the time he didn't. Then they reached a picture from their wedding day. His wife watched his face closely, waiting, hoping, praying for recognition. Donald stared at the photograph for nearly a minute, then looked up. his eyes filled with tears. For a second, she thought the memory had returned. Instead, he asked a question that broke her heart. "When did we get married?" The room fell silent. For Donald, it was a simple question. For his wife, it was devastating, because she suddenly understood something the doctors had been trying to explain for days. The man she loved had survived, but parts of him were still missing. Not physically, mentally. Entire years of experiences. Entire chapters of their life together. Gone. The family had spent weeks fearing death. Now they were facing a different kind of loss. A person can survive a disease. A person can survive a coma. But recovering the life that existed before, that was a much harder battle. And Donald's was only beginning. As Donald Walsh slowly recovered, his family kept asking the same question. How? How could a healthy man develop headaches, seizures, and a coma in less than a week? How could a disease erase years of memories? And perhaps most importantly, how had everyone been fooled into blaming the wrong thing? A week after Donald woke up, his neurologist gathered the family in a consultation room. For the first time since the nightmare began, she had enough information to explain what had happened. She pulled up images from Donald's brain scans. To the family, they looked like meaningless shades of gray. To the doctors, they told a story, a terrifying one. The neurologist pointed to several inflamed areas. This is where the damage occurred. Donald's wife stared at the screen. The affected regions seemed small, almost insignificant. The doctor explained why they weren't. Certain parts of the brain act like communication hubs. They help store memories, process emotions, recognize familiar faces, control behavior. When inflammation attacks those areas, the effects can be devastating. Then she explained autoimmune encephalitis. Normally, the immune system protects the body. It identifies threats, viruses, bacteria, parasites. Then it attacks them. But sometimes the system malfunctions. Instead of identifying an enemy, it mistakes healthy tissue for a threat. In Donald's case, it targeted his brain. His own immune cells crossed into areas they were never supposed to attack. Once they arrived, they triggered widespread inflammation. The swelling disrupted communication between brain cells. Signals became scrambled. Memories became inaccessible. Behavior changed. Confusion appeared. Then seizures. Then coma. The family listened in silence. The disease sounded almost impossible. The body attacking itself. The brain becoming a battlefield. Yet that was exactly what had happened. Donald asked the question everyone was thinking. So the Neti pot had nothing to do with it. The neurologist nodded. Nothing we found suggests it did. The timing had simply been unfortunate. The congestion, the Neti pot, the headache, the seizure. All of it happened so close together that the human mind naturally connected them. Doctors did the same thing. The Neti pot looked guilty. The timeline looked guilty. The symptoms looked guilty. But the evidence never supported it. The real disease had been there all along, hidden behind a much more obvious explanation. Then, the neurologist revealed something even more frightening. Without treatment, autoimmune encephalitis can continue progressing for weeks, sometimes months. The inflammation grows worse. The seizures become more severe. The brain suffers increasing damage. Some patients never wake up. Others survive with permanent disabilities. A few recover almost completely. Nobody could yet predict which category Donald would fall into. The family finally understood how close they had come to losing him. The coma wasn't the disease. The seizures weren't the disease. The memory loss wasn't the disease. Those were symptoms. The real enemy had been invisible. An attack taking place inside his own skull. An attack launched by his own immune system. And although the doctors had stopped it, the consequences were still unfolding. Because understanding what happened was one thing, living with what happened was something else entirely. The next challenge wouldn't be survival. It would be rebuilding a life that no longer felt familiar. Leaving the hospital wasn't the ending Donald Walsh had imagined. It was the beginning of another battle. The seizures had stopped. The inflammation was under control. The disease was no longer attacking his brain. But the damage it had left behind was impossible to ignore. The first week at home was frustrating. Simple tasks felt complicated. Conversations drifted away from him. Names disappeared moments after he heard them. He would walk into a room and forget why he was there. Sometimes he couldn't remember what day it was. Other times, he couldn't remember a conversation from an hour earlier. His doctors warned him that recovery would take time, possibly years. There were no shortcuts, no miracle treatment, no switch that could restore everything the disease had stolen. The only option was rehabilitation. So Donald began rebuilding, one piece at a time. Several days a week, he attended speech therapy. At first, that confused him. His speech sounded normal. Why did he need speech therapy? The answer became obvious during the sessions. The problem wasn't speaking. The problem was processing, finding words, recalling information, organizing thoughts. His therapist would show him photographs and ask him to identify objects. Some answers came instantly, others took minutes. Occasionally, he couldn't find the word at all. Those moments were humiliating. Donald had spent years working in a profession that depended on communication. Now he was struggling to name common objects. Physical therapy came next. Weeks in a hospital bed had weakened his body. His muscles had deteriorated. His balance wasn't what it used to be. Exercises that once seemed effortless now left him exhausted. Walking, stretching, climbing stairs. Everything required concentration. Everything required effort. But the most difficult sessions were the memory exercises. Those felt personal. Those reminded him every day of what he had lost. Therapists gave him notebooks, calendars, flashcards, photo albums, lists of names. They worked on recall, recognition, association. Every small success felt enormous. Every setback felt crushing. One afternoon, a therapist placed 10 family photographs in front of him. Donald identified 6 correctly, then 7, then 8. Weeks later, he recognized all 10. His wife cried when it happened, not because the exercise was extraordinary, but because it represented something larger, progress, proof that parts of Donald were still there, waiting to be recovered. Months passed. Slowly, life began moving forward. Some memories returned unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a familiar smell, a location he hadn't visited in years. Each one unlocked pieces of the past, but not everything came back. Some memories remained stubbornly out of reach. Entire conversations, specific events, important moments. The doctors explained that recovery isn't always perfect. The brain can heal. The brain can adapt. But sometimes, certain pathways never fully reconnect. Donald eventually learned to stop measuring his life against who he had been before. Instead, he focused on who he could still become. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, bad days, moments when frustration overwhelmed him, moments when he wondered if he would ever feel normal again. Yet despite everything, he kept improving. Month after month, session after session, small victories accumulated. And for the first time since he collapsed in the emergency room, the future no longer felt impossible. But there was one final question neither Donald nor his family could escape. After everything he had survived, after the coma, after the memory loss, after the rehabilitation, would he ever truly be the same person again? 2 years after the coma, Donald Walsh's life looked normal from the outside. He was alive. He was walking. He was working again. He could hold conversations, drive a car, pay bills, go to dinner with friends. To strangers, he appeared recovered, but recovery and restoration are not the same thing. Donald had regained a remarkable amount. His speech returned. His balance improved. The seizures never came back. Many of the memories that once seemed lost forever gradually resurfaced. Names returned. Places returned. Pieces of his life slowly reassembled themselves. The progress amazed his doctors. Yet there were reminders every day that the disease had left scars. Some memories never returned, entire conversations with loved ones, family vacations, birthdays, moments his wife treasured. For Donald, those experiences existed only through photographs and stories. He knew they happened. He simply couldn't remember living them. There were other changes too, subtle ones. His wife noticed them before anyone else. Donald became more cautious, more reserved, less spontaneous. The man who once made decisions without hesitation now analyzed everything. The man who once loved surprises now preferred routine. His personality wasn't completely different, but it wasn't completely the same either. The disease had altered something difficult to measure, something impossible to see on a scan. For a long time, Donald struggled with that reality. He wanted his old life back, his old brain back, his old memories back. Eventually, he accepted something important. The goal wasn't becoming the person he had been. The goal was becoming the best version of the person he still was. That shift changed everything. Instead of focusing on what had disappeared, he focused on what remained. His family remained, his future remained, his second chance remained. Many patients with autoimmune encephalitis never receive treatment in time. Some never wake up. Some never recover independence. Some never make it home. Donald did. But survival came with a price measured not in scars or surgeries, but in memories, in missing years, in pieces of himself that could never be fully recovered. And perhaps that's what made his story so unsettling. The thing everyone feared wasn't what nearly killed him. The thing everyone blamed wasn't responsible. The danger had been hiding somewhere no one expected. Inside his own immune system, inside his own brain, and by the time anyone recognized it, the damage had already begun. He used a neti pot. 72 hours later, he was in a coma. Doctors blamed the neti pot. The family blamed the neti pot. Almost everyone blamed the neti pot. The timeline seemed obvious. The explanation seemed obvious. The answer seemed obvious. But the real cause had been hiding somewhere else. While everyone searched for something entering his brain, his own immune system was attacking it from within. By the time doctors discovered the truth, the damage was already done. He survived. He woke up. He went home. He rebuilt his life. But he never got all of himself back. Some memories were lost forever. Some parts of the old Donald never returned. Sometimes the most obvious answer isn't the right one. Sometimes the real threat is the one nobody sees coming. And sometimes surviving is only the beginning. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos, and every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. Also, it's completely free. And if you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next video. Good night.
This is Hidden Pathogens.